Welcome to the coastal plain of the Holy Land in the year 1191, as a Crusader army of approximately 12,000 men prepares to march south from Acre toward Jaffa under the command of King Richard I of England, when the Third Crusade is attempting to recapture Jerusalem from Saladin's forces, when European knights and soldiers must learn to fight and march in desert conditions, wearing armor designed for the temperate climate of Western Europe. For the next few hours, we will explore how Crusaders actually survived desert marches while wearing heavy armor, examining the brutal physical toll of heat and exertion, the water logistics that meant the difference between survival and death, the adaptations and failures that characterized European warfare in the Middle East, and the often devastating consequences when medieval military practices met the harsh realities of desert campaigning. If you enjoy these detailed explorations of the practical challenges behind famous military campaigns, please like and subscribe to support our channel. Our story begins in the Crusader camp outside Acre on an August morning, as the sun rises over the Mediterranean and the temperature begins its daily climb toward perhaps 100 degrees Fahrenheit or more. A knight named Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, a 32-year-old veteran of several years of crusading, is preparing for another day's march, donning the armor that marks him as a member of the military elite, but that will also subject him to extraordinary physical suffering before the day ends. Geoffrey is a minor nobleman from England, not wealthy, but possessing enough land and resources to equip himself as a knight. He has been in the Holy Land for 2 years, has fought in numerous battles and skirmishes, and has learned through painful experience the challenges of operating in this climate while wearing the armor and equipment that his status requires. The process of arming begins with the underlayers. Geoffrey first dons a linen undershirt, light fabric that will absorb some sweat and provide a minimal barrier between his skin and the armor. Over this goes a padded garment called an akiton or gambeson, multiple layers of linen or wool stitched together, approximately 1/2 inch thick, covering the torso and extending to mid-thigh with sleeves to the elbows. This padded garment serves multiple functions. It provides cushioning under the mail armor, distributing the weight and preventing the metal rings from pinching skin. It provides some protection in its own right. The padding can absorb impact from blows that don't penetrate the mail, and it provides minimal insulation against the heat conducted by the metal armor. But that same insulation that protects against metal heat also traps body heat, creating a layer of warmth that will become oppressive as the day progresses. Geoffrey knows from experience that within hours he will be soaked with sweat, that the gambeson will become sodden and heavy, that the combination of sun, exertion, and trapped heat will push his body to its limits. Over the gambeson goes the mail hauberk, a shirt of iron mail extending from neck to knees, with sleeves to the wrists, composed of thousands of interlocking iron rings. Geoffrey's hauberk weighs approximately 35 pounds, distributed across his shoulders and torso. The weight itself is manageable when standing still, but when marching for hours, when climbing hills, when fighting, the cumulative burden becomes exhausting. The mail is effective armor. It provides excellent protection against cuts and slashes, reasonable protection against arrows at longer ranges, and flexibility that allows freedom of movement. But in the desert heat, it becomes an instrument of torture. The iron absorbs heat from the sun, conducting it to the padded underlayers and to Geoffrey's skin. Within an hour of full sun exposure, the mail will be hot to the touch. By midday, it will be painfully hot, burning skin anywhere it makes direct contact. Over the hauberk, Geoffrey wears a surcoat, a long sleeveless tunic made from linen or wool, typically white or light-colored, emblazoned with his personal heraldic device. The surcoat serves partly as identification, allowing allies to recognize him in battle, and partly as sun protection for the mail, the light-colored fabric reflecting some sunlight and reducing the direct heating of the metal beneath. Many Crusaders have learned to wet their surcoats before marching, the evaporation providing some cooling effect. Geoffrey will do this today, though he knows the cooling is temporary. In the desert heat, the surcoat will dry within an hour, and the evaporation, while cooling, also draws moisture from his body through the layers beneath. His head protection is a mail coif, a hood of mail covering the head, neck, and shoulders, over which he wears an iron helmet with a face guard. The helmet is perhaps the most oppressive piece of equipment in the heat. It traps heat around the head, prevents cooling airflow, channels sweat into the eyes, and creates a stifling microclimate that by afternoon will leave Geoffrey dizzy and disoriented from heat stress. Some Crusaders have begun wearing turbans or cloth wrappings over their helmets, imitating local practice, providing shade and some insulation against direct sun on the metal. Geoffrey has adopted this practice, wrapping white linen around his helmet, creating a crude but effective sun shield. His weapons include a sword, a double-edged blade approximately 36 inches long, designed for both cutting and thrusting, carried in a scabbard at his left hip. A kite shield, a large wooden shield covered with leather and reinforced with iron, approximately 4 feet tall and 2 feet wide, provides protection in combat, but is awkward to carry during marches. A lance, approximately 12 feet long, serves as his primary weapon when fighting mounted. Geoffrey also carries a dagger as a utility tool and backup weapon, and several other items in a bag attached to his saddle. A whetstones for sharpening blades, spare straps and buckles for armor repair, a small amount of food, dried bread, salted meat, and most critically, a large water skin holding approximately 1 gallon of water. 1 gallon of water is not nearly enough for a day of marching in desert heat while wearing armor. A man in these conditions can easily require 2 or 3 gallons of water per day, possibly more if exertion is extreme. But carrying more water is impractical. Water is heavy, 8 pounds per gallon, and the additional weight adds to the burden that Geoffrey must already carry. The army's water supply is managed centrally, with pack animals carrying barrels and skins of water that will be distributed during rest halts. But the quantities available are always marginal. The army requires perhaps 15,000 gallons per day for 12,000 men, plus water for thousands of horses and pack animals, totaling perhaps 50,000 to 60,000 gallons daily. Obtaining and transporting such quantities is a constant logistical challenge. Geoffrey's horse, a destrier, a warhorse specifically bred and trained for combat, represents another massive logistical burden. The horse requires perhaps 10 gallons of water per day in these conditions, plus substantial quantities of fodder. The horse is also suffering from the heat, though horses handle heat somewhat better than humans in armor, having evolved cooling systems, sweating, panting, that work reasonably well in hot conditions. As Geoffrey completes his arming and mounts his horse, the eastern sky is brightening toward full sunrise, and the army is forming up for the day's march. The plan is to cover approximately 12 miles today, following the coastal road south, staying within reach of the sea, where wells and water sources are more common than inland. 12 miles might seem a modest distance, but in the conditions the army faces, heat, armor weight, the need to maintain defensive formation against possible attack by Saladin's forces, it represents a full day's effort that will push many men to the edge of heat exhaustion or beyond. King Richard rides along the forming column, inspecting the troops, offering encouragement. He is also armored, also suffering from the heat, but he projects confidence and determination, the leadership necessary to keep the army moving despite the hardships. "Today we march for Jaffa," Richard announces in French, the language of the Crusader nobility. "The heat will be severe, but we are English, we are French, we are warriors of Christ. The Saracens think the heat will defeat us. We will prove them wrong. Maintain formation, conserve water, watch for enemy scouts. God wills it." The army responds with the Crusader battle cry, Deus spalt, God wills it, though the enthusiasm is tempered by the knowledge of what the day ahead holds. This is not the first desert march these men have endured, and they know the reality behind the rhetoric. As the sun clears the horizon and the march begins, Geoffrey settles into the rhythm of mounted travel, his horse walking at a steady pace, the armor already beginning to heat in the strengthening sunlight. The endless march across the desert in heavy armor has begun, a test of endurance that will separate those who survive from those who fall to heat, exhaustion, or enemy action. 2 hours into the march. The sun is well up in the sky, the temperature is approaching 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and Geoffrey is already suffering significantly from heat stress. Let us follow him through these first hours of the march, observing the physical effects of desert heat on armored men and the techniques they employ to survive. Geoffrey's body is producing enormous amounts of heat through the exertion of riding, the weight of armor, the tension of constant alertness. In normal conditions, this heat would be dissipated through sweating. The evaporation of sweat from skin provides cooling, but the multiple layers of clothing and armor prevent effective heat dissipation. The linen undershirt is soaked with sweat, plastered to his skin. The gambeson is absorbing sweat but cannot dry effectively. The mail hauberk over it prevents airflow, trapping moisture, The mail itself is heating from sun exposure, the iron conducting heat inward toward Jeffrey's body, rather than allowing heat to escape. The result is that Jeffrey's core body temperature is rising. Normal human core temperature is approximately 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. When core temperature rises above 100 degrees, heat exhaustion begins. Above 104 degrees, heat stroke becomes likely, a life-threatening condition where the body's cooling systems fail completely. Jeffrey can feel the heat stress building. His heart is racing. The cardiovascular system works harder to pump blood to the skin for cooling, creating additional internal heat. His breathing is rapid and shallow. He feels increasingly dizzy, his vision occasionally blurring. These are warning signs that his body is struggling to manage heat load. The mail coif and helmet create particular problems. The head is sensitive to heat stress, the brain requires stable temperature to function properly, and overheating impairs judgment, coordination, and consciousness. But the helmet traps heat, prevents cooling airflow, creates a stifling environment. Sweat runs down Jeffrey's face from under the helmet, stinging his eyes, dripping off his chin. His hair under the mail coif is completely soaked. He can feel heat radiating from the helmet itself, the iron absorbing sun and conducting it to the mail coif and to his scalp beneath. Many knights have learned to remove their helmets while marching, wearing only the mail coif for protection against opportunistic arrow shots from distant enemies. Jeffrey has his helmet hanging from his saddle, providing some relief, though he knows he must don it again if combat threatens. His greatest immediate concern is water. He has already drunk perhaps a pint from his water skin, 1/8 of his gallon supply, and he desperately wants more. His mouth is dry, his throat parched, his body demanding hydration. But he knows he must ration carefully. The next water distribution is not scheduled for another 2 hours, and if he empties his water skin now, he will have nothing for the afternoon, when conditions will be even worse. This water rationing creates a cruel dilemma. Drinking adequate water would help his body cope with heat stress. Hydration is essential for effective sweating and for cardiovascular function. But drinking all available water now might leave him with nothing later when he might need it even more desperately. Jeffrey sips sparingly, taking just enough water to wet his mouth, swishing it around before swallowing, trying to maximize the psychological relief while minimizing actual consumption. Around him, other knights and soldiers are doing the same, all locked in the same struggle between immediate thirst and future need. The army marches in a specific formation designed for both movement and defense. The infantry, common soldiers, many wearing lighter armor than the knights, march in organized companies on the flanks, creating a protective screen. The knights ride in the center, ready to mount charges if Saladin's cavalry attacks. The baggage train, pack animals carrying supplies, water, food, equipment, travels in the center, protected by the fighting men. This formation is necessary because Saladin's forces are nearby, watching the Crusader march, probing for weaknesses, ready to attack if the Crusaders become disorganized or vulnerable. The Crusaders must maintain defensive formation even while enduring the heat, adding psychological stress to the physical burden. Around mid-morning, approximately 3 hours into the march, the army makes its first scheduled halt. The order passes down the column: halt for water and rest, 15 minutes. Jeffrey dismounts gratefully, his legs unsteady from hours in the saddle and from heat stress. He leads his horse to where pack animals are distributing water, soldiers filling water skins from large barrels, a scene of controlled chaos as 12,000 men attempt to access limited water supplies. The water distribution is strictly rationed. Each man receives perhaps a pint, 1/8 of a gallon, barely enough to replace what has been lost to sweating. Jeffrey drinks his ration quickly, the water warm and stale tasting, but desperately welcome. He also wets a cloth and wipes his face and neck, the moisture providing momentary cooling. His horse also receives water, perhaps a gallon, significantly less than the animal needs, but all that can be spared. The horse drinks eagerly, clearly suffering from thirst, but accepting the limited ration because it has no choice. During the halt, Jeffrey performs a quick equipment check. His mail appears intact, though several rings show slight damage that will require repair eventually. His sword is secure in its scabbard. His shield is sound. But he notices that one of the straps securing his saddle is showing wear, fraying from the constant friction and from the corrosive effects of salt from his sweat. He attempts a field repair, tightening the strap and reinforcing it with a spare leather lace from his repair kit. This kind of maintenance is constant necessity. Equipment subjected to harsh conditions degrades quickly, and failures at critical moments can be fatal. Around him, other soldiers are in various states of distress. Some look relatively composed, handling the heat reasonably well. Others are clearly suffering, faces flushed red, breathing labored, movements uncoordinated. A few have collapsed, overcome by heat exhaustion, and are being treated by the army's few medical personnel.
The treatment for heat exhaustion is simple, but limited.
Move to shade if available, though shade is scarce on the open coastal plain. Remove armor to allow cooling, provide water if available, rest. Some men recover with these measures. Others continue to deteriorate, developing heat stroke, potentially dying if their core temperature cannot be reduced. Geoffrey watches as one soldier, a young man at arms, perhaps 20 years old, is stripped of his armor after collapsing. The man's skin is flushed and dry, a bad sign. It suggests his sweating has stopped, indicating heat stroke. His breathing rapid and shallow, his consciousness impaired. Water is poured over him in an attempt to provide cooling, but the prognosis is poor. Many men who reach this state die, and those who survive often suffer permanent damage. This death from heat is as deadly as combat, killing dozens of men on a harsh day's march. But the army cannot stop to care for all casualties. The strategic imperative to reach Jaffa and the tactical necessity of maintaining movement before Saladin's forces can concentrate for attack require the march to continue. After 15 minutes, the order comes, resume march, fall in. Geoffrey mounts again, his brief rest having provided minimal recovery. If anything, he feels worse than before the halt. The momentary relief has made the resumption of suffering more psychologically difficult. But he has no choice. The army moves, and he moves with it, continuing south under the blazing sun. The afternoon will be worse. The temperature will peak in the early afternoon, reaching perhaps 100 degrees or more.
The cumulative effects of heat exposure will build. The water supplies will dwindle further.
Some men will fall and not rise. Others will reach the evening's camp barely alive, damaged by heat in ways that will take days or weeks to recover from, if they recover at all. This is the reality of Crusader desert marches, not the dramatic battles of legend, but the grinding suffering of European warriors in armor, attempting to function in conditions their equipment and training never prepared them for. Surviving through determination, through careful water management, and through accepting casualties that would be considered catastrophic in European warfare. By noon, the Crusader army has covered approximately 6 miles of its planned 12-mile march, and the situation is becoming critical for many men. The temperature has reached its daily peak, approximately 104 degrees Fahrenheit in the sun, and the combination of extreme heat, heavy armor, and inadequate water is pushing significant numbers of soldiers beyond their physiological limits. Geoffrey himself is in severe distress. His core body temperature has risen to perhaps 103 degrees, approaching the threshold for heat stroke. His heart rate is dangerously elevated, perhaps 140 beats per minute, as his cardiovascular system struggles to pump blood for both exertion and cooling. His sweating has become less effective. His body is dehydrated to the point that sweat production is impaired. He experiences increasing cognitive impairment, difficulty concentrating, confusion about directions, slowed reactions. His vision periodically blurs or narrows to tunnel vision. He sways in the saddle, his balance affected by the physiological stress. These symptoms indicate that he is approaching the edge of heat stroke, that his situation is becoming medically dangerous. Around him, other soldiers are in similar or worse condition. One night, a companion Geoffrey knows from months of shared campaigning suddenly slumps forward in his saddle, unconscious, sliding sideways before other riders catch him and lower him to the ground. His squire removes his helmet and mail coif, revealing a face that is dangerously flushed, skin that is hot and dry to the touch. Clear signs of heat stroke. Water is poured over the fallen knight, his armor is removed as quickly as possible, attempts are made to cool him, but the prognosis is poor. Heat stroke can be fatal even with modern medical care, and medieval medicine has limited ability to treat it. The knight may die within hours, or he may survive, but with permanent neurological damage from the period when his brain temperature exceeded safe limits. The infantry soldiers, while wearing less armor than knights, are suffering their own crisis. Many wear mail shirts or padded armor, heavy enough to create heat stress, but without the horses that knights ride. They must walk, carrying their weapons and equipment, exerting more physical effort than mounted men. Dozens of infantrymen have fallen, unable to continue. Some are helped along by comrades, arms draped over the shoulders of companions who are themselves barely capable of walking. Others collapse completely and must be loaded onto pack animals or carts if they are to continue with the army, taking up space and weight capacity needed for supplies. Some fallen men are simply left behind. This sounds brutal, and it is, but the army cannot halt its march to care for all casualties. The strategic situation, the threat of attack by Saladin's forces, the need to reach Jaffa, requires forward movement. Men who cannot keep pace are left with whatever water can be spared and with prayers for their recovery or for mercy on their souls. The horses are also suffering catastrophically. Horses handle heat better than armored humans, but they have limits. The destriers, the heavy war horses that carry knights, are particularly vulnerable. These horses are bred for strength and combat capability, not for endurance in desert heat, and they are carrying heavy riders plus armor and equipment. Geoffrey's horse is showing serious signs of heat stress. The animal's breathing is labored, its coat is covered with foam from excessive sweating, its gait is unsteady. The horse is suffering from the same heat stress mechanisms that affect humans: rising core temperature, cardiovascular strain, dehydration. If the horse collapses, Geoffrey will be reduced to walking, a devastating blow to his combat capability and to his status. A knight without a horse is barely a knight at all, unable to perform the mounted charges that are the core of knightly warfare. But beyond the strategic concerns, Geoffrey has developed a bond with this horse over months of campaigning, and watching the animal suffer creates genuine distress. He tries to help the horse. He dismounts and walks alongside for a time, reducing the weight the animal must carry. He gives the horse some of his own water ration, though he knows he may regret this sacrifice later. He speaks to the horse soothingly, though he knows the words provide no physical relief. Around midday, the army makes another halt, unscheduled, forced by the sheer number of men and horses in distress. King Richard himself is suffering from heat stress. He is younger and fitter than many of his knights, but even he is not immune to the physiological effects of marching in armor in extreme heat. Richard makes the difficult decision to extend the midday halt from the planned 15 minutes to a full hour, allowing men and horses additional recovery time. This decision has strategic costs. It allows Saladin's forces more time to position for potential attacks, but it is necessary to preserve the army's fighting capability. During this extended halt, the medical crisis becomes fully apparent. The army's physicians and monks, the closest thing the Crusaders have to medical professionals, are overwhelmed with casualties. They move from victim to victim, providing what limited care they can, removing armor to allow cooling, administering water, offering prayers. The medieval understanding of heat illness is primitive. The humoral theory of medicine, which dominated medieval European medical thought, interprets heat illness as an imbalance of bodily humors, particularly an excess of choler, yellow bile, or blood. Treatments based on this theory include bloodletting, removing blood to restore balance, and purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea to eliminate excess humors. These treatments are not just ineffective, but are actively harmful. Bloodletting removes fluid volume that the body desperately needs for cooling, while purging causes additional dehydration. But medieval physicians don't understand the physiological mechanisms of heat illness, so they apply the medical theories they have been trained in, often worsening outcomes. Some treatments are helpful despite the flawed theoretical basis. Removing armor and clothing to allow cooling is correct. Providing water is essential. Moving patients to shade helps. Some physicians recommend drinking wine mixed with water, which provides both hydration and calories. While alcohol is generally dehydrating, small quantities in a heavily diluted mixture may provide some benefit through the water content and through the psychological comfort. Geoffrey himself drinks from his water skin during this extended halt, allowing himself a more generous ration than during the brief morning stop. His water is nearly exhausted, perhaps a pint remaining of the original gallon, but the extended halt provides opportunity to refill from the communal supplies. The refilling process reveals the deteriorating water situation. The barrels and skins that the pack animals carry are half empty or more. The wells that the army passed this morning have been exhausted by 12,000 men and thousands of animals drawing water. The next reliable water source is perhaps 4 miles ahead, a distance that seems insurmountable given the condition of the army. King Richard consults with his subordinate commanders, barons, knights, military religious order leaders about whether to continue the march or to establish camp here and resume movement in the evening when temperatures cool. The arguments are practical and brutal. If we camp now, Saladin's forces will see our weakness and may attack, argues one commander. We must maintain movement, demonstrate strength, reach defensible positions. If we continue in this heat, we will lose hundreds of men to heat sickness, counters another. We will reach Jaffa with an army too depleted to fight effectively. Better to rest now and march in the evening. Richard weighs these competing concerns and makes his decision. We rest for 1 hour, then continue. We march until we reach the next water source, regardless of how long that takes. Men who cannot continue will be left with what supplies we can spare. The army must reach Jaffa. God will protect the faithful. This decision reflects the harsh calculus of medieval military command. The strategic objective, reaching Jaffa, maintaining the campaign momentum, outweighs the immediate welfare of individual soldiers. Men will suffer and die to accomplish the strategic goal, a cost that Richard accepts as necessary.
As the hour's rest concludes and the army prepares to resume the march, Geoffrey hoists himself back into the saddle with difficulty, his body so fatigued that mounting requires assistance from his squire. The horse barely responds to his commands, the animal so exhausted that it moves mechanically, maintaining position in the column through training rather than through willingness. The afternoon march continues, each mile harder than the last, each hour bringing new casualties, the army's condition deteriorating, but its movement continuing through determination, discipline, and the acceptance of catastrophic suffering as the price of conducting European-style warfare in desert conditions. As the army struggles through the afternoon, let us examine in detail the water logistics that mean the difference between survival and death for the Crusaders, and how these logistics shape the entire strategic and tactical situation. Water is the single most critical resource for an army operating in desert or arid conditions. While food can be rationed for days or even weeks, with relatively manageable consequences, water cannot be significantly rationed without rapid deterioration of combat effectiveness and high mortality rates. The Crusader army requires approximately 50,000 to 60,000 gallons of water per day, roughly 15,000 gallons for the 12,000 men, averaging about 1.25 gallons per man, which is actually insufficient in these conditions, and 35,000 to 45,000 gallons for the horses and pack animals, averaging 8 to 10 gallons per animal. This enormous quantity, 60,000 gallons weighing approximately 500,000 pounds, cannot be carried by the army. At 8 pounds per gallon, carrying even a single day's water supply would require thousands of pack animals devoted exclusively to water transport, animals that would themselves require water and fodder, creating an unsustainable logistic spiral. Instead, the army must obtain water from the environment, relying on wells, springs, streams, and rivers encountered along the march route. This dependency on environmental water sources fundamentally constrains the army's movement options. Route planning is dominated by water availability. The army cannot march through areas that lack adequate water sources at intervals allowing daily replenishment. Deserts and arid regions that lack water are impassable barriers regardless of the strategic benefits that crossing them might provide. The coastal route that Richard's army is following was chosen primarily because it provides relatively reliable water access. Wells exist at intervals of 10 to 20 miles, close enough that the army can reach water sources within a single day's march. The proximity to the Mediterranean provides additional security. In emergencies, seawater can be used for some purposes, cooling, washing, though it cannot be drunk. But even on this favorable route, water logistics are precarious. Each well encountered must provide enough water for 60,000 gallons of demand. Many wells cannot sustain this level of extraction. They contain limited water volumes in their reservoirs, and their recharge rates cannot keep pace with the demands of a large army. When the Crusader army arrives at a well, the well is typically drained completely within hours. The first units to arrive get adequate water. Units arriving later get progressively less. The last units to arrive may get minimal water or none at all, creating inequality in suffering and in survival that maps to the army's organizational hierarchy,
Knights and important personnel get priority access, common soldiers get what remains. This inequality, while pragmatic from the command perspective, knights are more valuable militarily and are harder to replace than common soldiers, creates morale problems and exacerbates casualty rates among the lower status personnel, who are already more vulnerable due to less effective armor and less access to horses. The water quality is also variable and often poor. Many wells in the Holy Land contain brackish water, water with high mineral content, particularly salt. Brackish water is drinkable and better than no water, but it is less effective for hydration than fresh water, and it can cause gastrointestinal distress. Some water sources are contaminated with biological or chemical pollutants, causing dysentery or other waterborne diseases. Medieval understanding of disease transmission is primitive. They don't understand that bacteria or parasites in water cause illness, so they have limited ability to identify and avoid contaminated sources. The army does employ some water treatment methods, mostly based on empirical observation rather than scientific understanding. Boiling water is known to make it safer, though the mechanisms are not understood. Filtering water through cloth or sand removes some visible impurities. Adding wine or vinegar to water seems to reduce illness rates, though again, the mechanisms, the slight acidity creating an environment less favorable to some pathogens, are not understood. But these treatment methods are imperfectly applied and are sometimes impractical. Boiling water requires fuel and time, both of which are limited during a march. Filtering removes only gross contamination, not dissolved minerals or microscopic pathogens. The result is that waterborne illness is common, adding to the casualties from heat stress. Geoffrey himself has experienced dysentery multiple times during his years in the Holy Land, the severe diarrhea and abdominal cramping that result from drinking contaminated water. The condition is debilitating and potentially fatal if severe, and it creates a vicious cycle. The diarrhea causes dehydration, requiring increased water consumption, which often means drinking more contaminated water, perpetuating the illness. The water logistics also create strategic vulnerabilities that enemies can exploit. Saladin's forces understand that the Crusaders are dependent on specific water sources, and that denying access to water can be more effective than direct military confrontation. Saladin's strategy during this campaign includes destroying or contaminating wells along the Crusader route, forcing the Crusaders to travel longer distances between water sources, increasing heat casualties. Muslim forces also position themselves to attack Crusader forces at wells, knowing that the Crusaders must attempt to access water regardless of tactical disadvantages. This creates situations where the Crusaders must fight while exhausted and dehydrated, defending well access against enemies who are relatively fresh and who have secure access to their own water supplies. The battles fought under these conditions heavily favor the Muslim forces, demonstrating how logistics can determine military outcomes as much as tactics or courage. The Crusaders attempt to counter these strategies through various measures. Advanced scouts identify water sources and assess their security before the main army commits to approaching. Combat units are positioned to defend wells while the army waters. Some wells are captured and held by forward units, allowing the main army to water without fighting for access. But these countermeasures are only partially effective. The fundamental constraint that the Crusaders must access water from limited sources at predictable intervals cannot be overcome, and it creates vulnerability that skillful enemies exploit. As the afternoon progresses and the army continues its march, the water situation reaches crisis levels. Many men have exhausted their personal water supplies. The communal barrels are nearly empty. The next known well is still perhaps 2 miles ahead, a distance that seems infinite to men suffering from dehydration and heat exhaustion. Geoffrey is in serious condition. He has not urinated for several hours, a sign of severe dehydration.
His thirst is overwhelming, making concentration on anything else difficult. His cognitive function is significantly impaired. He has difficulty following orders, difficulty maintaining position in the column, difficulty performing the constant vigilance that desert campaigning requires. Around him, other soldiers are in similar or worse condition. Some men are drinking from any water source they can find, including stagnant pools that are obviously contaminated, driven by thirst beyond caring about the consequences. This desperation drinking will cause dysentery outbreaks in the coming days, creating additional casualties, but the immediate need overrides future concerns. Finally, as the sun begins to descend toward the western horizon and some relief from peak heat begins, the advanced scouts report that the well is in sight ahead. The army increases pace slightly,
men and horses detecting water nearby and responding with a final effort. When they reach the well, the scene is controlled chaos. Units take turns accessing the water in organized rotation, but the thirst and desperation are evident. Men push forward, attempting to reach water sooner, requiring officers to maintain order with threats and occasionally with force. Geoffrey waits his turn with his unit, watching as the well is gradually drained by thousands of men and animals drinking their fill. Where his turn finally comes, he dismounts and approaches the well, drawing water in a bucket, drinking directly from the bucket without bothering to transfer it to his water skin. The water is warm, brackish, and tastes of minerals and soil. It is the most delicious thing Geoffrey has ever tasted. As the sun sets, and the army establishes camp for the night, approximately 10 miles south of the morning starting point, the immediate crisis of the march has passed, but the consequences will unfold through the evening and the following days. Let us examine the evening routine and the recovery process after a devastating day of desert marching. The camp is established in a defensive position, a slight rise that provides visibility in all directions, reducing vulnerability to surprise attack. The perimeter is secured with pickets and sentries. The horses and pack animals are gathered in the center of the camp, where they can be protected and where they have access to the limited grazing available. Geoffrey unsaddles his horse and examines the animal carefully. The horse has survived the day, but barely. The animal's coat is crusted with dried sweat and foam. Its breathing is still labored. Its eyes are sunken, a sign of dehydration, and its gums are tacky rather than moist, another dehydration indicator. Geoffrey leads the horse to water, allowing it to drink slowly and in controlled quantities. Allowing a severely dehydrated horse to drink unlimited quantities immediately can cause colic or other digestive problems, so water is rationed initially, with additional amounts provided gradually over hours. He also attends to his own recovery. After watering his horse, he removes his armor piece by piece, the relief profound as each layer comes off. The gambeson is soaked with sweat, weighing perhaps 10 pounds more than when dry from the absorbed moisture. His linen undershirt is plastered to his skin. His skin is red and irritated from the chafing of wet fabric and from the heat conducted through the armor. He drinks heavily from his refilled water skin, consuming perhaps half a gallon over the course of an hour. His body absorbs the water desperately, beginning the recovery from severe dehydration. He also eats some food, dried bread, softened with water, salted meat, dried fruit, replacing not just water, but also the salts lost through extensive sweating. The salt replacement is important, though medieval understanding of why is limited. Extended sweating depletes the body's sodium and other electrolytes, and replacing these is necessary for recovery. The Crusaders have learned empirically that eating salty foods and drinking broths made with salt helps recovery from heat stress, even if they don't understand the physiological mechanisms. Around the camp, the day's casualties are being assessed. The informal casualty count from today's march is sobering. Perhaps 30 to 40 men dead from heat stroke, another 100 seriously incapacitated and unlikely to continue with the army, several hundred horses dead or too lame to continue. These losses, approximately 1% of the army's strength in a single day without any enemy action, are devastating. If the army continues to suffer such losses daily, it will be combat ineffective long before reaching its objectives.
The dead are buried quickly. Shallow graves marked with simple crosses, prayers offered by chaplains, bodies consigned to the earth before decomposition becomes advanced in the heat. There is no time or resources for elaborate burials. The dead are honored, but cannot be allowed to consume the living's energy and attention. The seriously incapacitated face difficult fates. Some will be loaded onto carts or pack animals and will travel with the army, hoping to recover sufficiently to resume their duties. Others, too sick to travel and unlikely to recover, will be left behind with minimal supplies and with prayers for their souls. Some of these men will die. Others may recover and eventually make their way to friendly territories. A few may be captured by local populations, their fates uncertain. As darkness falls and cooking fires are lit throughout the camp, the army's mood is grim. The men understand that today's march was extraordinarily difficult, but they also understand that tomorrow will likely be similar. The campaign is far from over, and many more days of desert marching lie ahead. Geoffrey sits near his unit's fire, eating a simple meal of porridge made from grain, flavored with salt and onions. The food is unappetizing, but provides necessary calories and nutrients. He drinks tea, boiled water flavored with herbs, the hot drink somehow comforting despite the day's heat.
Around the fire, soldiers discuss the day's hardships, sharing stories of near collapse, offering sympathy to those who lost companions to the heat. There is camaraderie born of shared suffering, a bond that holds the army together, despite the devastating conditions. Some soldiers question the wisdom of marching in such heat, wonder aloud whether the strategic objectives justify the casualties. These mutterings of dissent are discouraged by officers and by the military religious orders, Templars and Hospitallers, who preach duty, crusading zeal, and acceptance of suffering as a test from God. God tests us with this heat, a Templar knight tells the gathered soldiers. He tests our faith, our commitment to the holy cause. Those who endure will be rewarded in heaven. Those who falter show weakness of faith. We march not for earthly glory, but for God's glory and for the liberation of Jerusalem. This religious framing helps maintain morale and discipline, providing meaning to the suffering, contextualizing the deaths and hardships within a broader spiritual narrative. Whether individual soldiers fully believe this framing varies, but the shared narrative provides social cohesion and helps prevent the kind of demoralization that could cause mass desertion or mutiny. As the evening progresses and exhaustion overcomes the soldiers, the camp gradually quiets. Sentries maintain their watches, but most of the army sleeps. Collapsed in exhaustion from the day's ordeal, Geoffrey lies on the ground, wrapped in a cloak, trying to sleep, despite the continuing heat of the desert night. His body aches from the day's exertion, his skin is tender from sunburn and from chafing. His mind replays the day's miseries and anticipates tomorrow's repetition. But he also feels a grim satisfaction at having survived. He is still alive, still capable of fighting, still able to continue the march. Tomorrow will bring new hardships, but tonight he has water, food, rest. For a crusader in the desert, this is enough.
As we conclude our exploration of how Crusaders survive desert marches in heavy armor, let us step back from the immediate narrative and examine what historical sources tell us about these practices, what adaptations the Crusaders attempted, where they succeeded and failed, and what this reveals about medieval warfare and cross-cultural military conflict. The historical evidence for Crusader desert marches comes from multiple sources: contemporary chronicles written by participants and observers, letters from Crusaders to families in Europe, Muslim accounts of Crusader campaigns, and archaeological evidence from battle sites and march routes. These sources paint a consistent picture of extraordinary hardship. The chronicles repeatedly mention heat casualties, describe soldiers collapsing during marches, record disputes over water access, and detail the various attempts to cope with desert conditions. The casualty figures we've described, 1% of armor strength per day during harsh marches, are consistent with historical accounts. What adaptations did the Crusaders attempt? Over the 2 centuries of crusading activity, 1095 to 1291, European forces learned numerous lessons about operating in Middle Eastern conditions. First, equipment adaptations. The white circlets worn over armor, originally developed for identification, were recognized as providing sun protection. Some Crusaders began wearing lighter armor, mail shirts rather than full hauberks, padded armor rather than mail, open-faced helmets rather than fully enclosed ones. Orders like the Templars and Hospitallers, with permanent presence in the Holy Land, developed equipment specifically adapted to local conditions. Second, timing adaptations. Crusader commanders learned to avoid marching during the hottest parts of the day when possible, traveling in early morning and evening instead. Night marches were sometimes employed, despite the difficulties of maintaining formation and the vulnerability to ambush. Seasonal timing, conducting campaigns in cooler months rather than summer, became standard practice when strategic situations allowed. Third, route adaptations. Crusaders learned which routes provided reliable water access and which should be avoided. Coastal routes were preferred over inland routes. River valleys were favored. Knowledge of the terrain and water sources became military intelligence of the highest importance. Fourth, cultural learning. Some Crusaders adopted local practices, wearing turbans or head wraps for sun protection, consuming local foods better suited to the climate, learning from local Christians and from Muslim prisoners about water conservation and heat management. The military orders, with continuous presence spanning generations, accumulated and institutionalized this knowledge more effectively than short-term Crusader expeditions. But these adaptations had significant limits. The fundamental problem,
that European military culture emphasized heavy armor and cavalry shock action, while Middle Eastern conditions favored light cavalry and mobility, was never fully resolved. European armies could adapt at the margins, but they could not fully transform their military systems to match local conditions without abandoning the social and military traditions that defined knightly culture. The failures of adaptation were equally significant. European medicine remained ineffective for treating heat illness throughout the Crusader period. Water logistics remained precarious. No significant technological innovations improved water transport or storage. Armor design remained fundamentally European. Attempts at lighter armor often reduced combat effectiveness without proportionally reducing heat stress. The mortality rates from non-combat causes during Crusader campaigns were staggering. Estimates suggest that for every Crusader who died in combat, 5 to 10 died from disease, heat stress, exhaustion, or other non-combat causes. Some estimates place total Crusader deaths over 2 centuries at several hundred thousand, with perhaps 70 to 80% from non-combat causes. These mortality rates compare unfavorably with modern military operations. Even the deadliest modern wars typically show combat deaths exceeding non-combat deaths, reflecting superior logistics, medicine, and environmental adaptation. The Crusaders' inability to match even a 1-to-1 combat to non-combat death ratio indicates fundamental failures in adapting to the operational environment. The strategic consequences were profound. Crusader armies were constrained to coastal regions and river valleys where water was accessible. Inland operations were limited in duration and scale. The ability to hold territory was undermined by the difficulty of sustaining garrisons in hostile environments. The eventual failure of the Crusader states, the complete loss of European territorial holdings in the Holy Land by 1291, was partly due to these logistical and environmental challenges. The Muslim forces, operating in their native environment, with equipment and tactics adapted to local conditions, held decisive advantages in sustained campaigns. While European forces could win individual battles through superior armor and shock cavalry tactics, Muslim forces could avoid decisive battle, exhaust European forces through environmental stress, and gradually wear them down through attrition. The cross-cultural dimension is also significant. The Crusades represented collision between military systems optimized for different environments. European warfare evolved in temperate climates where water was abundant, where seasons enforced natural campaign breaks, where heavy armor was effective. Middle Eastern warfare evolved in arid climates requiring water management, in conditions favoring mobility over armor, in environments selecting for endurance over shock action. Neither system was objectively superior, each was optimized for its native environment. But when the systems met in the Middle East, the Europeans were operating on unfavorable terrain, while the Muslims enjoyed home field advantage. The results demonstrate the importance of environmental adaptation in military effectiveness. For modern readers, several lessons emerge. First, logistics and environmental adaptation often matter more than tactical prowess. The Crusaders were skilled warriors with effective equipment for their native environment. But these advantages were negated by the harsh environment and by their failure to fully adapt to it. Cultural and institutional factors can prevent necessary adaptations. The Crusaders knew they needed lighter equipment and different tactics, but their social system, which tied status to heavy armor and mounted combat, resisted these changes. Third, mortality from non-combat causes can exceed combat losses in harsh environments. Modern military forces invest heavily in logistics, medicine, and environmental adaptation, precisely because historical examples like the Crusades demonstrate the catastrophic costs of neglecting these areas. Fourth, technological or tactical superiority in one environment does not necessarily transfer to other environments. The heavy cavalry that dominated European battlefields was less effective in desert conditions, demonstrating that military effectiveness is always contextual. As we conclude our exploration of how Crusaders survived desert marches in heavy armor, we can appreciate both the extraordinary endurance they demonstrated and the fundamental challenges they faced. Men like Geoffrey de Montfort survived through determination, through accepting levels of suffering that would be considered unacceptable today, through adaptation at the margins of what their social system allowed. But we must also recognize that many did not survive. The dead from heat stroke, from dehydration, from waterborne disease, from the accumulated effects of marching in desert heat, wearing armor designed for European conditions. These casualties numbered in the tens of thousands over the Crusader period, demonstrating the terrible price of attempting to conduct European-style warfare in Middle Eastern environments. The endless desert marches that Crusaders endured, the daily suffering in heat and armor, the water crises, the heat casualties, the gradual adaptation and persistent failures, these represent a cautionary tale about the limits of courage and determination when confronting environmental and logistical challenges that exceed a military system's capacity to overcome.